Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, artists, you name it, all over the world of crypto and blockchain. And today you guessed it, I have another amazing guest. I'm really looking forward to this interview. I have the CEO and co-founder of Palisade. His name is Tom Kittle. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jamil, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. Yeah, so let's kick things off, and I'll ask you the first question: Is what is your background, and is it a logical background for what you're doing now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As I said, thanks so much for having me. Been super looking forward to this and excited for this today. I think my background is software engineering. I've been a software engineer for the past 20 or so years. But going back before that, I was always, as a child, someone that really liked to pull things apart and figure out how they worked. And that started at a really, really young age, pulling apart my parents' radio, for example. Later on in my early teens, I got my hands on the first family computer, and that sort of theme for learning continued. And this is where I first learned about software, HTML specifically, which ultimately led to a really long-standing career as a software engineer. Over the decades, I spent a lot of time building products in the payment space that involved like retail payments, e-commerce, and later on cross-border remittances. And I can talk a bit more about that later. And I think, of course, whenever you're working in those sorts of environments and spaces, security is always paramount. In the payments and card space, for example, we have something called PCI DSS, which is a security standard that sort of governs how you hold and secure card details on behalf of users. And then we have things like SOC 1, SOC 2, which are reports that focus on how businesses process information, how their systems are built, and the type of controls and systems in place to secure data and things like digital assets, for example. And so you work very closely around these sorts of processes. You become very comfortable and familiar with different standards, different types of audits when you work in the payment space. But I think more in line with what we're doing today at Palisade is probably my tenure at Ripple. So I spent 5 years working at Ripple as a software engineer. And I worked across everything from their payments network to a product that I was working on before I left Ripple called Liquidity Hub, which provisions crypto liquidity for financial institutions. But my introduction to digital assets started in around 2015 and 16, where I started learning about Bitcoin, the infrastructure, the blockchain. And then later in 16, 17, where I started to develop a really good understanding for how the technology worked. I was really interested in the technology, but more the application of that technology. And so for me in 2017, I'd sent a whole bunch of transactions across the blockchain. But it was the XRP ledger that really got me hooked. And it really made clear to me what the potential benefits were. When you could send, $10,000, for example, from one account to another, it would get there in 3 seconds and it would cost you a fraction of a penny. That for me was a light bulb moment. So it was around that sort of time in 2017 when I joined Ripple. And just to sort of reiterate, I spent around 5 years working on a number of different things there. I think one of the proudest things that myself and the rest of the team worked on there was a product called ODL. That was a mere proof of concept in 2017, 18. And today that's processing billions of dollars worth of value every week. And with that experience, comes a lot of learnings. And so, I'm a founder of Palisade today. But I think, with all of that experience, it was all of that experience that led me to where I am today. And actually, it's Ripple is the place that I met my co-founder, both being engineers with an entrepreneurial and sort of problem-solving mindset. In 2021, we set out to solve some of the bigger problems in Web3. Private key management being, what we landed on. Both feel very passionate about that. Private keys being the center of almost every interaction with the blockchain.
The people who I've talked to from Ripple have been some of the smartest people I've talked to. Just so it turns out that way. So, I want to dive in a little bit more about Palisade and what makes it, a game changer in today's ultra competitive environment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So just to pick up on that point that you made prior, I would totally agree. I think when you work for a company like Ripple, you surround yourself with people who are solving massive, massive problems in the world today, cross-border payments being one of them. And I think most people aren't aware of just how inefficient cross-border payments are. But to solve these problems, you need a large team of very, very smart people. So, for me and many others, there's lots of learnings that happen there for sure. So Palisade is what we describe as being a full spectrum digital asset custody and wallet provider. And on top of that, there is a ton of built-in utility as well. Now, what we mean by full spectrum is that Palisade is able to provide a really wide range of private key management options to our clients, depending on their use case. This includes everything from like a fully regulated custody to financial services, businesses, and institutions, and everything in between, from sub-custodial and even non-custodial solutions as well. Up until recently, providers of like wallets or custody infrastructure have either been pure technology providers, think Fireblocks, or heavily regulated, think Anchorage and BitGo. Something myself and Manthan, my co-founder, identified quite early on was that actually a lot of businesses and developers building in the Web3 space require a mix of both. So for seamless onboarding, they require non-custodial wallets. And to manage their own treasury, they require something like a regulated custody that you'd get from BitGo, for example. Now, what this means in terms of how Palisade operates with its clients is that it just means you have a single relationship. You have a single partner that you interact with for your wallets in your custody, and you don't need to sign up to Fireblocks and BitGo for all of these different use cases that you bring. I would say on top of that, though, we offer a lot of utility as well. So we spent the last 2.5-3 years building out the most secure wallet and custody infrastructure that we can. And now we're starting to roll out utility on top of that. So as well as all of the enterprise grade features that you'd expect from a custodian, including like a policy engine, access and governance controls, etc., we also have things like a tokenization engine, which sits on top of that, and access to staking and DeFi and things like that as well.
Very cool. Now you're in the EU.
We are, yes. Yeah.
And you talk about regulations. So you got this thing going on over there called MiCA.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's a bit of a big deal at the moment for sure. So Palisade we're registered and incorporated in the UK, but we actually have an office in France as well, regulated as a custodian in France, actually.
Great. So EU nations are preparing to enforce the MiCA regulations. They came out like a year ago, I think, maybe less. They're preparing now to enforce them, right? What do they have to prepare for? What do they got to do? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to do. I think MiCA is a big deal, and I think there is. We just to sort of give you a bit of background. So Palisade is regulated. Our strategy is to become regulated in many jurisdictions where it makes sense for us to operate. And whenever we look at a jurisdiction, there's a set of criteria that we apply. But one of those is, does it make sense? Does the framework make sense that the regulator has put out there? MiCA does. It makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of very, very strong clarity in the framework that they've built. But I think for many of the EU member states, there's still a lot of work to do. Alignment of legislation is one of those, and I think many of these nations have started to roll these changes out. But making sure that local laws are in line with MiCA is definitely something that they're needing to do and are doing actively. The infrastructure is a big piece as well. So making sure that the regulatory infrastructure is in place. This includes everything from the ability to monitor and enforce compliance with regulations, but also resourcing. I think resourcing is a really big part of this. You probably remember this in 2017, after that wild bull run. The FCA and other regulatory bodies, showed a bit of an interest in the crypto markets. And 2018, 2019 saw a huge influx of applications to bodies like the FCA, for example. The resourcing was not there to support it at the time. And so you ended up with like a 2-year backlog of applications. I don't think we want to be in that situation again. So I think resourcing is a really big part of this regulatory infrastructure that needs to be put in place and prepared for. Then I think there is just general engagement with stakeholders as well. Palisade has been really, really lucky in the respect of having engagement with different regulatory bodies. We've been privy to early blockchain sandboxes, for example, in some jurisdictions, and that enables bi-directional learnings where the regulator can really understand the nuances of different use cases and what the businesses are providing. So I think there's a lot of that to do as well ahead of the formal rollout of MiCA. And then I'd say there's probably definitely some international cooperation that needs to happen if it's not already. Crypto markets, by their very nature, are global. And I would say that there needs to be a lot of cooperation across different jurisdictions too. Information sharing and is obviously going to happen, I think, due to the nature and transparency of blockchain technology. And so different EU nations, different jurisdictions need to prepare to be in a position where they can share that information.
I agree. I didn't recall the backlog in 2019 or 20. I was occupied with different things, but I do remember the 600 days that my money was locked up in Celsius.
Yeah.
That was painful.
You're not going to forget that one in a hurry.
Ever. But the landscape needs to shift, right? You are a custodian, right?
Yes.
And it's important to reestablish, I'll use that word, reestablish, third-party trust.
Mm-hmm.
How is third-party trust going to drive success in the digital asset custody space going forward?
Yeah, this is a really good question and a really big deal for new entrants like Palisade. No one knew who Palisade was. We're only 2.5, 3 years old. And so trust is a really big factor here. I think, first of all, credibility. When a business is trusted by third parties, such as clients or regulatory bodies, it enhances the credibility for the company, for custody, and also just generally for the market. If we are seen as credible and trustworthy as well, obviously there's a competitive advantage there as well. I think it certainly helps for us from our perspective with market expansion as well. As we become regulated in multiple jurisdictions, as we prove ourselves as a trustworthy digital asset custodian, we can start to expand into other markets too. And then finally, I think something that's really important to us is long-term partnerships and innovation. Palisade and digital asset custody, generally speaking, is a relatively sticky product. There's risk involved when you move your assets from one custody provider to another, and you never want to be in a position where a client feels like they have to do that. And so I think there is a very, very big element of credibility and trust that needs to be built in order for those long-term partnerships to be produced. And then obviously innovation as well. So I think trust encourages a lot of innovation, generally more broadly across the whole industry, not just with custody providers, but the more trusted third parties we have and companies building in the space, I think the more innovation we can see.
All right. I like the fact that you're willing to work with the regulators. There are advantages in doing that. There are also disadvantages. What do you feel like? I mean, over the past year, we had people, and my politicians here are going to hate me for this, but they said we had regulatory capture here in the United States. They're going to say, that wasn't regulatory. I'm going to say, yes, it was regulatory capture. But working within the confines of a regulatory system that is fairly and fully communicated to you has its advantages and disadvantages. What are they, and what must we now do to adopt and move forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'm quite conservative, like in my approach to digital assets and innovation. I think innovation is incredibly important. Obviously, and we've seen a lot of that in the crypto space and blockchain space over the last 5, 6, 7 years. I think that being regulated, especially as a custodian, proves to your audience and your clients that you are mature and you're capable of holding assets. You've gone through the ringer, so to speak, with the regulator. They've put you through your paces. They have pulled apart your process. They've pulled apart your executive team. And they've essentially given you the stamp of approval to say, hey, look, we think that you're fit to do this. I think anyone that is building in the Web3 and crypto space that thinks that is not important, I think probably hasn't paid attention to how the financial services industry operates. We essentially have this whole new paradigm, right? Around transferring value, creating value. I think it's naive to think that the market can operate in unregulated conditions. I think regulation is good for everyone when applied sensibly. And so I think it needs to be there. I don't think anyone would argue that it's a good thing, but it needs to be applied sensibly, and it also needs to allow for flexibility and future innovation. I would say though, for new entrants to the crypto space, it's difficult. I think to answer the sort of second part of your question there is it's difficult. It comes with a lot of overhead. There are cost implications involved. There are lots of resource implications as well. You need a compliance team. You need to build out an AML framework. You need to have a flexible business model. If regulation or the framework within the jurisdiction that you operate changes, your business model might need to adapt. And so I think it's certainly not easy, but I think it's critical. I've always thought that. I've been in the payment space for quite a long time, and so for me it feels quite natural. But I think for newer entrants to the market, I think it can feel like quite a jarring thing.
I think my main concern in this right now, and when I look at the whole entire market in its entirety, is security,
Yeah.
right? And you mentioned stickiness. And I want to first find out the role that you think security has, the importance of security, and then I'll get into the stickiness after that.
Yeah, I think as I said at the beginning, like the center of every interaction with a blockchain, almost every interaction of a blockchain is a private key. Private key essentially like proves the ownership of the account and it signs off on the movement of your assets. Um, Everyone has their own threshold, but I think you never want to be in a position where your assets can be compromised. And so I think what we're seeing over time is that no one is arguing that security is important and that security of the private key or the digital assets comes in many shapes and sizes. It can be done with a HSM, an MPC, it can be decentralized, it can be done with multi-sig. No, I don't think there is any debate that security is important. Um, I I have definitely seen a shift from non-custodial wallets when clients reach a certain value threshold to a more of a regulated custody or a third party that they can rely on to secure those assets.
Yeah, I see that. I see that. I also see. I think last month 1 million new meme coins were created, and people are rushing into them without thinking about security or even the fact if you see the name of a coin on a wallet, you have like 7 or 8 or 9 with the same name. So I think security is being thrown out the window in the chase for 1 million X,
Oh
right?
yeah, there is no doubt about that. Absolutely. I think Um, and I think it really depends on who you speak with, and at what level people are operating, and what's important to them. Because 100%, if there is a quick buck to be made, security is not so important, right? This is the primary objective. Let's trade some meme coins. Let's make a buck. I think it becomes important though if you did 100x or you did 1,000x, it starts to become a bit more important. And so I think it depends on who we're talking about, what level they're operating, etc. I think definitely if you're speaking with an enterprise or a larger business, security is always paramount. I do also think, though, that a lot of users buying into these meme coins, they're usually using something like MetaMask. And the problem I see with solutions like MetaMask, for all of the good they've brought to the industry, because I think they've got a fantastic product, is that the onus is still on the end user. The private key lives in the browser. And there really aren't many controls in place to protect scams, for example. Like I've heard so many stories recently where there have been phishing scams or scams where someone's clicked sign transaction and it's just drained the entire Ethereum wallet. Um, I think there definitely needs to be better controls in those cases to protect these sorts of users. I just don't think the product's there to support that. I have no doubt that anyone trading meme coins or staking assets, or whatever it is they're doing in DeFi, if they had the ability to set policy rules or transaction limits within MetaMask, they would. Um, Obviously Palisade's ideal customer is we're pretty much strictly B2B today. And so most of the clients that we work with are not trading meme coins today, or not that I know of anyway.
That's smart of them. So, um, awesome. So I want to talk about this. I'm gonna stay on the regulatory area. There's regulatory challenges that are facing CASPs, right? What are some of them that remain and how will they change going forward?
Yeah, I think We talk about this a lot, actually. I think one of the big ones here is the differences between different jurisdictions. There is a very fragmented approach globally to regulation. And I think when, I've said earlier that we all know that the blockchain technology and the crypto markets are inherently global. And so I think in an ideal world, there would be much more uniformity applied to regulation across multiple jurisdictions. Now, MiCA does that for Europe, which is fantastic, but there are still nuances slight nuances between the different EU member states. So, I don't know, a decade from now, it'd be great to see more uniformity across different global jurisdictions. I think also there is definitely different requirements from the regulator, like in terms of data collection as well. Just to go a bit deeper into that, that makes it difficult. Like the obligations set by the FCA are very, very different from, say, the regulator in Singapore. And so I think it would mean building out a completely separate compliance team in that region that has very, very different requirements. And so there are like cost overheads there. There's resource overheads as well.
I kind of bucket things into three categories. Well, no, not three, much more than three categories. But there's the EU, which is moving forward, with the regulations positively, proactively. You have Asia, which is embracing new technologies, and Hong Kong, which is one of the most, in Singapore, which is, very, very active in trying to change their old regulations. And then you have the US wants to hold on to the laws from 100 years ago, right? What is that uniformity, if there is uniformity in the coming sometime, what does that look like? And what needs to happen to get there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, yeah, the I've spent a bit of time in the US, but I'm definitely not an expert on regulation there. But it certainly seems there is like this regulation by enforcement that's taking place, and I think we've seen that recently with the SEC's word on non-custodial wallets, falling under the category of being an MSB. We saw it with Ripple as well. We've seen it in a bunch of different cases, right? I think in an ideal world, we'd see a global definition of different asset classes, different types of operations that happen on a blockchain. What does it mean? What does staking mean? What is a stable coin? What are the different types of stable coin? What are the other types of asset classes that can be tokenized on a ledger? We'd have a global definition of what custody means, what a non-custodial wallet is. I think having it's almost like a glossary. It's like an agreed glossary of what all of these things mean. I think that would be an amazing first step. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where a different global jurisdictions agree 100%. But it would certainly make the lives of businesses building this space easier if there was sort of agreed definitions for some of these things.
Yeah, I agree too. I agree too.
I mean, just to add a little bit more, I mean, there are more and more companies moving out of the US now, moving to either Asia or Europe, and there is lots of differences between Asia and Europe, but there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of agreement between some of these things. It's a shame that the US is a massive market, and it's always stood for innovation. It's not quite clear from an outsider's perspective how things are going to pan out there. But yeah, anyway, I think to digress a little bit, I think it would be great to see some global cooperation and definition of some of these things.
I spoke to somebody the other day who said, if you don't like where you're at, learn how to code. You can go
Yeah.
anywhere and stay there.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Yeah.
So, I do want to thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed speaking with you, and I have one last question. It's how can people find out more information about Palisade, about you? How can they use your platform? How can they do that?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. So you can find Palisade at palisade.co. As I said, we're a digital asset custody provider. We're typically B2B. We also work with B2B2C organizations as well. If you're looking for secure, regulated digital asset custody or wallet infrastructure as technology, you can find our contact details on the website, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's linkedin.com/tkittle.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Of course. Thank you so much, Jamil. Take care.